friends, colleagues, and concerned citizens. Let me begin tonight with a simple but urgent question. What does it mean when a missile from Yemen explodes in the heart of Tel Aviv, striking a crowded train station? On the surface, we see only the immediate tragedy, lives lost, families shattered, a city shaken to its core. But beneath that surface lies a deeper, systemic story, one about global power, endless wars, and the economics of empire. The explosion that tore through Tel Aviv's central train station has shaken not only the city, but also the larger conversation about security, power, and vulnerability in the Middle East. A missile fired from Yemen, one of the most embattled, impoverished, and war-torn countries in the world, managed to land deep inside Israel, striking an area known less for its military importance and more for its daily rhythm of ordinary life. Commuters rushing to work, students heading to classes, families meeting or returning home, all found themselves in the middle of a sudden and violent eruption that transformed routine into catastrophe within seconds. And that is the first hook we cannot ignore. If a missile can reach the heart of Tel Aviv, if it can strike a hub of public transportation, then what illusions of safety remain for any civilian population anywhere in the region? Witnesses describe the moment as chaos unleashed. The blast ripped through waiting platforms, sending metal, glass, and smoke into the air, while screams and confusion echoed across the station. Rescue teams raced in, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of injured, by the sight of lives cut short in the most mundane of settings. It was not a battlefield, not a military base, not an arms depot. It was a place of commuters and everyday people. A fact that makes the political message of the strike as powerful as the physical damage itself. The hook here is unavoidable. When wars are fought without solutions, they inevitably spill over into the lives of those who never chose to fight them. Politically, the attack represents a dramatic breach. Israel, long considered one of the most heavily defended nations in the world, with advanced missile interception systems and layers of intelligence surveillance, found itself exposed in the most visible way possible. A train station is not only a transportation hub, it is a symbol of normality, of stability, of a city's pulse. To see it shattered so publicly is to see, in real time, the limits of technological security when political and economic justice are absent. The event becomes a message not just from Yemen to Israel, but to the entire world. No fortress is unbreakable, no system invincible, and no nation immune to the blowback of unending conflict. For Yemen, the act itself reflects both desperation and defiance. A country strangled by years of blockade, famine, and bombardment has nonetheless demonstrated an ability to project force outward in a way that commands international attention. It is a reminder that asymmetric power, where a weaker side uses limited but strategic tools, can still disrupt the stronger side's sense of dominance. For Israel, the impact is more than physical damage. It is psychological, it is political, and it is economic. The fear that spreads after such an incident ripples far beyond the station's walls. Parents wonder if their children are safe on their daily commutes. Businesses worry about disruptions, investors calculate risks, and all the while, politicians face mounting pressure to respond in ways that may only perpetuate the cycle of violence. What hooks us most deeply, though, is the human reality behind the headlines. In those minutes after the explosion, Tel Aviv's train station was no different from any urban center around the world, a place where ordinary lives intersected in the routine of public life. The randomness of who was standing where, who was entering the station and who was leaving, who survived and who did not, tells us more about the true victims of geopolitical struggle than any military briefing ever could. It is ordinary men, women, and children, workers and students, shoppers and travelers who pay the highest price when missiles fly. This single strike, therefore, becomes a symbol larger than itself. It tells us that the wars we imagine as distant, as confined to certain territories or certain populations, will not remain there. They will find their way into train stations, into marketplaces, into the daily patterns of life. And if a missile can shatter Tel Aviv's central hub, then the question for all of us, whether in the Middle East, in Europe, or in the United States, is this: how long before we recognize that true safety does not lie in higher walls, bigger budgets, or more weapons, but in ending the conflicts that breed such violence in the first place? The shockwave from the Yemeni missile strike on Tel Aviv reverberated far beyond the immediate destruction of the train station. It sent a ripple of unease across the entire Middle East, a region already caught in a web of fragile alliances, unresolved conflicts, and simmering grievances. This was not just another attack to be cataloged among many in the long history of violence in the region. It was a bold, unexpected, and deeply symbolic act that pierced through the perception of Israeli invulnerability and raised urgent questions about the balance of power. And here lies the first hook. If a country like Yemen, battered by years of civil war, foreign intervention, and crippling economic isolation, can project force into the heart of Tel Aviv, what does that say about the strategic stability of the region as a whole? In capitals across the Middle East, Riyadh, Tehran, Cairo, Ankara, leaders watched the news with alarm. For allies of Israel, the strike represented a dangerous breach of what they believed to be one of the most advanced security architectures in the world. For rivals of Israel, it was proof that even the most technologically sophisticated defense systems can be penetrated. That asymmetry can still rewrite the rules of engagement. The Iron Dome, so often presented as an impenetrable shield, failed to intercept a missile that managed to travel hundreds of kilometers and land in one of the busiest civilian areas of Tel Aviv. The symbolism is powerful. If Israel's defense system is not absolute, then neither is its claim to control the battlefield or dictate the terms of regional security. What makes this event particularly explosive in its political ramifications is the timing. The Middle East is a tinderbox of unresolved conflicts between Israel and Palestine, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between various internal factions in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen itself. The strike from Yemen into Israel is not just a single act of aggression. It is a spark in an already combustible environment. The hook here is clear. When a single missile can shift the psychological terrain of an entire region, the potential for escalation multiplies and the costs of miscalculation grow dangerously high. Public reactions within Israel also matter deeply. The image of a crowded train station in Tel Aviv transformed into a site of carnage was broadcast across the globe, but inside Israel, it struck at the heart of public trust. Citizens who believed in the protective capacity of their government, their military, their technology, suddenly found themselves wondering whether safety could truly be guaranteed. That kind of doubt is politically destabilizing. It pressures governments to act decisively, often aggressively, to restore the appearance of control. And yet, every retaliatory strike, every escalation risks widening the conflict and pulling in actors far beyond the immediate circle. This is the dangerous cycle. Security is breached, retaliation follows. Retaliation provokes counter-retaliation, and the region slides deeper into instability. Meanwhile, the perception outside Israel is equally volatile. For countries sympathetic to Yemen's cause, the strike is celebrated as a symbolic victory against a far more powerful adversary. For others, it is condemned as reckless and indiscriminate, targeting civilians rather than military objectives. In either case, the political narrative is shifting. Yemen, long viewed as a victim of foreign domination and proxy wars, has suddenly cast itself as an actor capable of reshaping the geopolitical conversation. That shift cannot be ignored. It forces regional and global powers alike to recalculate their strategies, to reconsider their assumptions about where threats originate and how far they can reach. This is why the strike is not contained to Tel Aviv, not contained to Israel and Yemen. It reverberates outward, pulling in questions of Iran's role in supporting Yemeni forces, Saudi Arabia's long war in Yemen, the U.S. posture in the region, and Europe's uneasy balancing act between diplomacy and defense. Every capital is now asking if Tel Aviv can be hit where else is vulnerable. That question alone changes the calculus of regional politics. It raises insurance premiums, disrupts trade flows, strains alliances, and adds fuel to an already dangerous geopolitical fire. And the most sobering hook of all, the strike demonstrates that in the modern Middle East, borders are porous to violence, and the assumption that some cities are untouchable has been shattered. The shockwave from this explosion is not just the tremor of physical destruction. It is the deeper, quieter shock of realization that no one in the region is beyond reach, and that the conflicts too long ignored or mishandled are now returning with consequences that can no longer be contained. The most devastating element of the missile strike on Tel Aviv was not merely its geopolitical shock or its exposure of security vulnerabilities, but the direct toll it took on civilians. The explosion in the train station left ordinary people, workers on their way to jobs, students carrying books and laptops, families traveling together, suddenly trapped in an inferno of smoke, debris, and panic. In the blink of an eye, the routines of daily life were shattered and lives were lost or permanently altered. This is the first hook that must seize our attention. No matter the rhetoric of politicians or the calculations of military strategists, it is never the generals, never the diplomats, never the corporate elites who pay the first and highest price. It is always the ordinary people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time who absorb the human cost of conflicts they never chose. Eyewitness accounts tell of chaos that words can hardly capture, screams echoing through the platforms, people clawing through dust and rubble to find loved ones, rescuers stumbling through fire and mangled metal to pull survivors from the wreckage. The randomness of survival adds a cruel layer of tragedy. One commuter survives by running late to a train. Another dies simply because their train was delayed by a few minutes. These tiny accidents of time remind us of the fragility of life in a world where political choices can so easily turn public spaces into battlegrounds. The hook here is visceral. Every commuter in Tel Aviv, and indeed every person who rides a bus, takes a subway, or walks through a train station anywhere in the world, is forced to confront the terrifying thought, what if it had been me? From a political standpoint, the civilian toll is not just a humanitarian tragedy, but also a catalyst for outrage and fear. Governments are judged, often harshly, by their ability to protect their citizens. The sight of blood-soaked platforms and terrified families will undoubtedly intensify the demand for accountability from Israeli leaders. Citizens may begin to question whether vast sums poured into defense systems truly deliver safety when an adversary with limited resources can inflict such damage. The pain of the victims becomes, in this way, a political force, one that can drive governments to retaliate more aggressively or pursue even harsher measures in the name of security. But the irony cannot be overlooked. The very measures meant to respond to civilian deaths often create the conditions for more civilian casualties down the line, perpetuating a grim cycle without end. Globally, the images from Tel Aviv's train station hit home because they resonate with universal fears. Whether it is a bombing in London, Paris, New York, Baghdad, or Gaza, the pattern is the same. Civilians in spaces of everyday life suddenly become the unwilling front line of wars they do not wage. It strips away the illusion that wars are confined to soldiers or battlefields. A train station, a market, a school. These become the true sites of modern warfare, where the line between civilian and combatant is blurred, if not erased altogether. And this is another hook when civilians are no longer safe. When daily life itself becomes the target, then war ceases to be distant politics and becomes an immediate, intimate terror for entire populations. The tragedy also underscores the moral failure of leadership across the region and the world. Civilian protection should be a universal priority, enshrined in international law and championed by those who claim to defend human rights. Yet, time and again, the deaths of innocents are dismissed as collateral damage, as regrettable but unavoidable. Such language dehumanizes the victims and numbs the public to the true horrors of war. By framing the loss of civilian life as inevitable, leaders avoid the harder truth that their policies, their aggressions, and their failures of diplomacy make such tragedies not just possible but predictable. And let us not forget the longer-term cost. Survivors of the Tel Aviv blast will carry physical scars, psychological trauma, and financial burdens for years to come. Families torn apart will live with grief that no political speech or compensation package can ever heal. Children who witness the chaos will grow up with memories of fear and loss that shape their view of the world. This intergenerational trauma ensures that violence does not end with the explosion. It seeps into the future, shaping politics, identities, and grievances for decades. This is why the civilian toll is more than a tragedy. It is the most dangerous accelerant of conflict. The deaths and injuries at the Tel Aviv station will fuel anger, demand vengeance, and deepen divides. Each civilian life lost becomes both a personal grief and a political weapon wielded by those seeking to justify further escalation. The true horror is that as this cycle repeats, the civilians of tomorrow are already marked unknowingly as the next victims. And this, perhaps, is the most piercing hook of all. In every missile strike, every explosion, every so-called act of war, it is the people who had no say in the conflict who become the most eloquent testimony to its futility. The strike on Tel Aviv's train station is not just an isolated act of violence. It is a spark that threatens to ignite an even larger regional fire. When a missile from Yemen manages to pierce one of Israel's most defended spaces, the immediate question is not only about the tragedy of that day, but also about what comes next. The risk of escalation now hangs like a storm cloud over the Middle East, where every action breeds a reaction and every retaliation risks spiraling into something far bigger than what either side originally intended. The first hook here is sobering. History tells us that wars often begin not with grand strategies, but with single shocking incidents that snowball beyond anyone's control. For Israel, the pressure to respond is immense. A government that has prided itself on its ability to defend its citizens now faces widespread doubt. Political leaders cannot afford to appear weak or hesitant, especially after civilians have been killed in a setting as public as a train station. Calls for retaliation are certain to grow louder, not only from politicians, but also from citizens demanding both justice and deterrence. Yet the paradox is clear. Every strike Israel launches in response risks provoking new counterstrikes, widening the scope of the conflict. And here is the deeper danger. When governments respond to attacks with overwhelming force, they rarely contain the violence. Instead, they feed the very cycle they claim to want to break. From Yemen's perspective, the missile strike has already sent a message of strength and resilience. But having proven that it can hit Tel Aviv, what incentive is there to stop now, especially if further Israeli or Allied bombardments rain down on Yemeni cities? Each new round of violence risks expanding the war from a series of isolated exchanges into a sustained confrontation across borders. The hook is chilling. When weaker actors realize they can wound stronger adversaries, the temptation to keep striking grows, while the stronger side feels compelled to crush that challenge before it gains momentum. This is how regional conflicts escalate into wars that engulf multiple countries. The strike also pulls in outside powers, willingly or unwillingly. Saudi Arabia, already deeply entangled in the Yemeni conflict, now faces a strategic dilemma. If the conflict between Yemen and Israel deepens, Riyadh may find itself dragged back into a war it has tried in recent months to de-escalate. Iran, suspected of backing Yemeni missile capabilities, is watching closely, aware that any Israeli retaliation could target its allies directly. The United States, long committed to supporting Israel's security, may feel compelled to offer more military aid, intelligence, or even direct involvement. Each of these moves raises the stakes. Each new actor pulled in multiplies the risk of miscalculation, making the conflict harder to contain. Meanwhile, neighboring states such as Lebanon, Syria, and even Egypt watch nervously. The Middle East is already a chessboard of overlapping conflicts, alliances, and grudges. A strike on Tel Aviv may embolden other groups hostile to Israel to launch their own attacks, hoping to exploit a moment of vulnerability. Israel, in turn, may widen its military campaigns in multiple directions, stretching the conflict into new theaters. The hook here is grim. Escalation in the Middle East rarely stays confined to two actors. It radiates outward, drawing in countries, militias, and global powers until the entire region is destabilized. The economic dimensions of escalation cannot be ignored either. Every missile fired, every counterstrike launched raises the cost of security not only for Israel and Yemen, but for global trade and energy markets. Investors grow skittish. Oil prices spike and shipping lanes face new risks. A conflict that began with a single missile can end up disrupting economies thousands of miles away, affecting workers and consumers who may never hear the full story behind the headlines. And this is another hook worth holding on to. Wars do not just kill people, they ripple into markets, households, and lives in places far removed from the battlefield. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this moment is the unpredictability of human decisions under pressure. Leaders in Tel Aviv, Sana'a, Tehran, Riyadh, and Washington all face domestic audiences demanding action. In such moments, rational calculation often gives way to political survival. Escalation is not always the product of grand designs, but of leaders choosing short-term appearances of strength over long-term stability. The risk is not only that the violence continues, but that it spirals far beyond what any one side originally intended. And so, the strike on Tel Aviv forces the region into a crossroads. On one path lies escalation, retaliation, and the kind of regional war that could engulf millions. On the other lies restraint, dialogue, and recognition that unchecked retaliation will only deepen the chaos. The hook that lingers is simple yet urgent. A single missile has already shaken the region. But how leaders respond will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point toward peace, or the opening chapter of a much larger disaster. The missile strike in Tel Aviv reverberates far beyond Israel's borders, carrying implications that shake the confidence of nations and unsettle the foundations of global security. The sheer fact that a missile launch from Yemen, A nation long devastated by war, famine, and economic collapse could land deep inside one of the most technologically advanced and militarily fortified countries on Earth, sends a chilling signal to the international community. It is no longer simply a question of what happened in Tel Aviv that day, but of what this event reveals about the vulnerabilities of modern states and the illusions of invulnerability that global powers so often project. The first hook is stark if Israel, with its Iron Dome, American backing, and reputation for intelligence prowess, can be breached in such a dramatic way. What city in the world can confidently say it is safe? For decades, Israel has been held up as a model of security architecture, an example of how cutting-edge technology combined with strategic alliances can defend a nation from external threats. The Iron Dome and other missile defense systems were seen almost as miracles of engineering, capable of intercepting rockets before they reached civilian areas. Yet, in a single night, those assumptions cracked. A Yemeni missile, relatively crude compared to the world's most advanced weaponry, slipped through those defenses and struck at the core of everyday life in Tel Aviv. This exposes a broader truth for the global audience. No system, no matter how advanced, is impermeable. That realization reverberates not just in Israel, but in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and European capitals, where leaders are forced to confront the reality that their own cities are more vulnerable than they like to admit. The global implications also extend to how wars are fought and how they ripple outward. Asymmetric warfare, where weaker powers use unconventional strategies to outmaneuver stronger ones, has once again proven its potency. Yemen, under immense military and economic pressure, demonstrated that it could bypass traditional battlefields and strike at the psychological heart of its adversary. For movements, militias, and nations across the globe, this serves as a model, a case study in how determination and unconventional tactics can puncture the armor of even the strongest opponents. And here lies the second hook. The more one side invests in projecting absolute dominance, the greater the incentive for others to find the one gap, the one weakness. That can undo the illusion of control. Markets, too, feel the tremors of such events. The Middle East remains a central hub for global energy supplies, and any sign of instability sends oil prices climbing, trade routes recalibrating, and investors retreating to safer assets. The strike in Tel Aviv is not only about casualties and military calculations, it is also about the way global markets react to risk. Shipping companies wonder about the safety of ports, airlines reconsider flight paths, and businesses brace for disruptions. The Tel Aviv explosion, therefore, does not stay contained within Israel's borders. It radiates outward into boardrooms and households around the world where the cost of living, the price of fuel, and the security of investments all become vulnerable to a war thousands of miles away. This is the often overlooked hook. The violence of missiles does not stop at the blast site. It travels invisibly, reshaping economies and lives globally. Diplomatic circles are equally unsettled. For allies of Israel, particularly the United States and parts of Europe, the strike forces an uncomfortable reckoning. If Israel can be penetrated, what does that say about the billions poured into defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and military aid? If deterrence has failed here, how much confidence can be placed in similar models elsewhere? For adversaries of Israel, on the other hand, the strike is a potent symbol. It emboldens narratives that even the mightiest military machines can bleed. That resistance, no matter how desperate, can draw blood. And that narrative spreads quickly, carried across television broadcasts, social media platforms, and political speeches, amplifying the symbolic power of a single missile far beyond its material impact. Another global implication lies in the response this event provokes. If Israel retaliates harshly, if the United States steps in more visibly, or if Iran is directly accused and targeted, the conflict could escalate into a regional war with global consequences. The world has seen before how localized conflicts in the Middle East ripple outward, disrupting oil markets, triggering refugee flows, and drawing in military commitments from great powers. The Tel Aviv strike, then, is more than just a security breach. It is a warning that escalation in this region rarely stays confined. The hook that lingers is unsettling. What begins with one missile in Tel Aviv may end with consequences felt in New York, Berlin, or Tokyo. At the human level, the global audience cannot escape the images of civilians bleeding in a train station, shocked faces covered in dust, families desperately searching for loved ones. Those images cut through politics and policy to reveal the cost of endless conflict. For viewers thousands of miles away, they raise uncomfortable questions. If such devastation can strike so suddenly in Tel Aviv, what about our own cities, our own daily routines? This is the psychological dimension of global implications. The realization that in an interconnected world, violence is never as distant as it seems. The aftermath of the Tel Aviv train station explosion has sparked predictable calls for vengeance, with officials and commentators demanding overwhelming retaliation. Yet amid the noise of anger, a quieter but far more urgent truth emerges. Lasting security will never be achieved through bombs, blockades, or military escalation. The strike illustrates in the most brutal way possible that the pursuit of safety through militarization is a hollow promise. And here lies the first hook. If a nation spends billions on defense but cannot prevent a single missile from Yemen, then what is truly being purchased with all that blood and treasure? Security built on military dominance is fragile at best and illusory at worst. The argument for justice over retaliation begins with a recognition of the human cost. The blast that tore through the train station did not distinguish between ideologies or allegiances. It struck workers, students, and families simply going about their day. To answer such a tragedy with further violence is to repeat the same cycle that created it. History is saturated with examples of retaliation that promise deterrence, but instead invite escalation. When violence becomes the language of policy, every new strike becomes both a response and a provocation, ensuring that the wheel keeps turning and that civilians remain the ones crushed beneath it. The hook here is unavoidable. If retaliation worked, would the world still be watching the same conflicts erupt decade after decade? Justice, by contrast, demands a deeper reckoning. It insists on addressing the root causes that make such violence possible in the first place. For Yemen, those causes include years of foreign intervention, economic strangulation, and humanitarian disaster. For Israel and Palestine, they include occupation, displacement, and cycles of inequality that stretch across generations. Retaliation ignores these causes. It papers over them with force. Justice, however, requires confronting them honestly, however uncomfortable that may be. And the uncomfortable truth is these missiles do not emerge from nowhere. They emerge from despair, from anger, from the perception, sometimes justified, sometimes manipulated, that dignity and survival are under attack. Unless those conditions are changed, no amount of military power can silence the will to resist. The global community has a choice in how it responds to moments like this. It can endorse retaliation, feeding the same patterns of destruction that guarantee more tragedies down the line, or it can press for dialogue, for negotiation, for recognition that the endless militarization of the Middle East has produced neither peace nor security. The hook is simple but powerful. Every dollar spent on weapons is a dollar not spent on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, or the rebuilding of societies. The explosion in Tel Aviv is not only a story about death in one city, it is also a story about misplaced priorities that extend across the globe, where governments justify limitless defense budgets while austerity cuts erode the foundations of civilian life. What makes the call for justice even more urgent is the symbolic power of this strike. The missile that reached Tel Aviv was not just a weapon, it was a message. It declared that no fortress is impregnable, no population shielded from the consequences of war. Retaliation would ignore that message and attempt to rebuild the illusion of security through force. Justice would acknowledge the message, admit that the current path is unsustainable, and attempt something different. And here is another hook worth holding on to. Real security is not the absence of enemies, but the presence of fairness. A society where dignity and opportunity are shared is far less likely to breed the anger and desperation that fuel violence. For Israelis and Yemenis alike, the path of justice would mean investing in life rather than death. It would mean prioritizing diplomacy over dominance, rebuilding communities over destroying them, and recognizing that every civilian, whether in Tel Aviv, Sana'a, or Gaza, has the same right to live without fear. This is not naive idealism, it is pragmatic realism. Retaliation has been tried again and again and has failed. Justice has rarely been attempted, yet it remains the only true alternative to perpetual war. The final hook lies in the lesson this moment offers the world. Missiles can be fired, defenses can be breached, and cities can be shaken. But unless justice becomes the foundation of policy, the explosions will not stop. They will only move from one place to another, one generation to the next. The question is not whether retaliation will happen, but whether we are willing, at last, to imagine something different. Let me close by saying this history is talking to us. It is shouting, in fact, from the rubble of a train station in Tel Aviv. It is telling us that the cycle of violence is unsustainable, that the people of Yemen, of Israel, of Palestine, of the entire region, and yes, of the entire world deserve better. And if we as citizens, workers, and human beings do not demand an end to the madness, then we will all, sooner or later, find ourselves standing in the wreckage of another explosion, asking again why.